It's tangible. It exists. We live in an unjust society. That is real. Now, how do we go about addressing that problem, addressing this injustice? Like you said, you cannot create another injustice to solve an injustice. I mean, it's as simple as two wrongs don't make a right, but it's a lot more complicated than that as well. That's an old saying that kids get hurt a lot, but there's a depth to that saying that is really important. When we're thinking about justice, a just response to an injustice is as important as identifying what the injustice is. Connotation-wise, in the past 5 years, it's really shifted some of its connotation to be kind of seen as a way of imposing empowerment on other people. So developing agency, I just use that word, but I don't think there's anything wrong with the word empowerment. I've just seen it shift in the literature. So like, if you model humility, say, I can be wrong. My perspective, I'm sharing a perspective right now.
Welcome everybody. This podcast is all about you. Why knowledge matters. Welcome, I'm Yannick, your host, and now joining me, Joseph Levitan. Joseph Levitan is a professor at McGill University at the Department of Integrated Studies for Education, and now he is here to discuss equality, equity, and justice, and what it ultimately has to do with education and why it should be more just than more equal or equitable. Welcome, Joe. Such a pleasure to have you back.
Hi, Yannick. It's great to be back. Great to be here.
So good to really discuss with you these three topics, because they are somehow also contagious, not just within education, but also at the broader scale, also at the political level, by the way. So let's dive into it and let's educate us on what you mean or what you understand from your perspective and how it is understood more broadly, and why we should actually be a little more specific.
So yeah, thanks, Yannick. So I think even before we get started on the topics of equality, equity, and social justice, I want to talk a little bit about two really important points when it comes to thinking about these really important, but also really complex ideas. So the first is thinking about how we define terms and the denotations and connotations of terms, which is really important. And also, I want to make a distinction between principled thinking and contextual thinking. So let's start with principled thinking and contextual thinking. Principled thinking means we take an idea and we say, okay, for example, we want to make sure that there's equality of opportunity because that's really important. So that's a principle, right? So a principle means it's something that we hold on to in terms of our values. It has some kind of intrinsic motivation for us to really understand kind of or orient ourselves around the way we want to live our lives, right? So there's a principle of equality is one, is like we want things to be fair, so we might use the term equality. Like if it's I don't know, my sister and I wanting to split food, it's probably fair for it to be equal if that's a principle that we hold to be true. Not all people think equality is a principle that we want, but we can have a debate about the principles themselves. But those principles are ways for us to have orientations to our lives. And that's one kind of thinking. And a lot of legal scholarship is about principles and creating good principles that are ethical and valuable, and policy more specifically. Maybe I should be very specific and talk about policy in particular, and thinking about how do we create our principles to orient our policy. Contextual thinking is a completely different way of thinking, because it's not about the values that we have, but it's about applying or thinking about from the context itself what we need to do. So, for example, contextual thinking is really looking at, I'm in a situation. Let's say I have 20 students and 3 students are struggling with some material. In that context, what do I do? Do I spend more time working with those 3 students and let the other students do something else? Do I let this, kind of put the 3 students off to the side and focus on the majority of the students? What is it that I do with this specific context? In this particular context, we can apply a lot of different principles. And it's really important to think about how in different contexts might rely on different principles and picking the right principle to be applied to the context. Because sometimes contexts have inherent tensions within them that make it difficult to know exactly what principle we need. So, for example, in this uh, time where, for example, there are 3 students who are struggling with some material, and it's 20, and there are 17 students who've understood the material, and we need to continue to move on in the curriculum. What do you do here? There's a principle that is equality, which would mean that they all have had the same opportunity to explore this material. And even though they're struggling with it, everything's equal. So it's fair. So if they just can't keep up, then that's on them. Equity is a different orientation. That's a different principle. So in this instance, those 3 students may need more supports. So it would actually be better for an equity perspective to devote more time to those students and let the other students advance in a different way and spend less time with them, because we actually want everybody to get to a certain minimal level. And so those are 2 different ways of approaching the same context, but through 2 principles that sound similar, equity and equality, but in fact are quite different in action. And when we think about these 3 concepts, equality, equity, and social justice, we're thinking about very different definitions of similar terms and how they may or may not be applied to specific contexts. So I think it's really important to recognize that there is principled thinking, and that's really about values and understanding how we want to live morally and ethically. And then there's contextual thinking, which is about making actual decisions and applying different principles in the right way. So, for example, in this case of the 3 students, my value system would be that these students would need some extra support, and the cost benefit of leaving other students to do some work on their own while working with these 3 students is worth it, because I want to make sure all students have a basic knowledge or a set of skills or abilities or capacities to continue to move forward. Other people might say, this is a competitive environment. And in fact, my value system is about competition. And so equality is where I want to go. And when we think about this distinction, it really allows us to understand what our principles actually are, rather than looking at the principles themselves and just saying, oh, yeah, I agree with, equality, or I agree with equity, or I agree with social justice, or I don't agree with these for whatever reason. Many people don't really think through the contextual relevance of these principles before adopting the principles. And it's only when you live contextualized experiences that you can start to understand what your deeper values are and what the principles you actually use are, rather than the ones that you may profess. And that kind of reflexivity, that's called reflexivity, that reflection upon your experience, to allow you to think through what your principles actually are and how you apply those and what that means to experience, is really, really important, not only for educational leaders or teachers, but for most people who are living in a society, because we want to know how we live, and we want to be consistent and coherent with our value systems and how we apply our values to real life. All of this is pretty complicated. Well, it's not super complicated, but it's kind of complicated in the day to day. But if you think about it from a policy level, then it gets even more complicated. So when we're looking at definitions of terms and their implications for action, it's really tricky when it comes to policy. Because one of the things that critical policy scholars say, which I think is really important, is that when you create a policy to solve one problem, you usually create 3 more, right? So, like, policy work, very difficult because it's a very tricky um, activity, because you don't really know what the unintended consequences are going to be of your policy.
I just
And
want to
one of the
quickly
ways to
jump in. I just want to quickly jump in into just make a tangible example in terms of like the individual level, and then let's hop to the policy level. Okay, what you're basically are saying, and I think this is really important, just kind of to make a little bit sense of it in terms of outside of academia. So I think you can really find out to some extent what your values are, what's really underneath, and what's really driving your action if you just look at equity and equality, right? Equity can to
Mhm.
some extent be thought of something that, let's an example of paying taxes. Okay, usually you pay, let's say, a certain percentage. Okay, so that's really uh, equity to some extent because everyone contributes the same percentage, okay, based on whatever he earns, right? So more or less everyone contributes the same, right? But if everyone, let's say, has to pay the same share, flat rate, well, that will be basically equality, right? So,
Yes.
and I
Yeah.
think one
So
of the
yeah.
really complicated things here is that to think here about the allocation, and I want to have your point of view in terms of education. Do you think, generally speaking, this is within educators, let's say teachers, a contested area of thinking of, okay, should I spend more time for these students because that's what we do, we apply here equity and not so much equality. How
Yeah.
does this
So I think
apply, generally speaking?
Mhm. So I think your tax example is a really great example for a number of reasons, and I want to add one more example to that. So the flat rate, which is everybody pays the same amount, is one way to think about equality. Everybody's paying the same amount, but we know that if everybody pays the same amount and somebody earns $100 a week and they have to spend $20 that week on taxes, and somebody who makes $1,000 that week and has to pay $20 on taxes, that affects the person differently, right? So that's equality. The unintended consequence of thinking about this in equality, and I think it was a great example that you gave, is that the effect of taking what's basically 20% of somebody's salary versus 2% of somebody's salary for the week affects the person differently. So even though it's equal, the effect is unequal. That difference for somebody who makes double the amount is still smaller because they have more money overall than the other person. And so when we talk about equity, there's also an idea that there's gradiated tax bracket that Canada uses, for example, and so does the United States to some degree, where the more money you make, the more you are taxed, because that's considered equity as well, because you have more money overall. And so you should pay more of your share. So there's three different levels of equity. And we're not even getting into social justice yet, but I think that that's really important to talk about because there's even within the debates between equality and equity, what is considered equitable can be hotly contested even within a specific context when it comes to something like paying your fair share of taxes. So that was a great example because we just had three different models. Um, so when we're looking at these different models and the contested spaces of equity, the same thinking can be true in education. So generally educators are, I would say, are equity focused. Like they want all children to succeed to a certain degree. And in fact, the testing or the evaluation metrics really ask for teachers to at least allow students to all hit a certain minimal level. So many teachers will devote a lot of time, and there are supports in place to make sure that students who may be struggling with a particular subject matter get the supports they need to be able to get this minimal level. And that's a good thing because we want our citizens, because education is not a competitive it education as a realm in society is not a competitive um, area for society. It's and one of the challenges that we've had when we talk about principles is that in classically capitalist societies where competition is part of the fabric of what makes the society, education is in direct contradiction to that principle, because what we need in education is to have, especially in democracies, is to have highly educated citizens to make smart choices, especially when they vote. And so even within a what's considered a kind of a free market open capitalist system, we need to have social supports to make sure that our democracy, which is neither capitalist nor socialist nor communist or anything, it's a democracy, which is a certain kind of social organization, while capitalism is a certain kind of economic organization. We need to have more social, communitarian, not communist supports so that all of our citizens can have a certain level of capacity. So most teachers buy into this, I would say. Some like the competition for A's, but nobody wants to have a competition for just barely squeaking by. We want everybody to be at an area where they can um, really accomplish the minimum and a standard that is high enough that we can trust that the people will be able to do what they need to do. Historically, that was not always the case. Historically, there was this thing called a bell curve. And so grading would be done by you'd pick the top, the cream of the crop, and they would be the top. And then you'd have the middle, and then you'd have the people that you'd have to cut off. Usually, this bell curve was done in higher education, but sometimes it was done in K through 12 education as well. And the idea was that the cream rises to the top and the best 10% should be running the country. And there's a whole philosophy and principle about we want the best to be running the country and the other people can take service jobs or blue collar jobs. And that's how the country should run. The best are going to be making the decisions. So we need to pick out the best from everybody else and make sure that they go on to be the ones making decisions. That principle changed in the late 20th and the early 21st century. And we're thinking, okay, that's not actually how a really great representative democracy works. In fact, a lot of the founding figures of the United States saw education as one of the pillars of democracy because a democracy is only as good as its most poorly educated individual citizen. So going back from there to now, people, and even in the Bush era, when we're talking about the United States and when we're talking about Canada and North America, because Latin America has a different history, Europe has a different history, and you might have some knowledge about that too, from having experience in different school systems. But the idea is that having an equity focus allows us to make sure that our citizens are able to be the intelligent citizens we need them to be to make intelligent votes, to make smart choices. So that's really what the rhetoric and the narrative has become in education, that we're looking at equity. And
I
then
just want to
when it,
quickly jump on this what you have said, because what you're really talking about is basically from where the term meritocracy really comes from, right? It was really based on really the bell curve, like on IQ, on your performance, on your standardized test, and so on, right? And that's basically now changing, to some extent at least. Well, there are some on the the far, as always, like the polarized poles that really find it somehow troubling. And I just want to ask you what you think, because there is this fear all the time of equality of outcome. Okay, so when we hear these terms, they're so loaded that from one, the left takes it, that takes it like just crazy far, and then the right obviously takes it to the other direction super far. So what do you think about this fear of the term? And just let's define it, equality of outcome, for example.
yeah, so now you're talking about contextual thinking, which is great. So equality of outcome is really thinking about the context in which equality is applied. So generally speaking, equality of outcome, one, is not really realistic. Like if the two of us took a math test and we're both adults, highly accomplished adults, one of us would probably be better than the other. Is that inherently unfair? Is that inherently problematic? I don't think so. And in fact, maybe one of us is more prone to mathematics rather than something like literature or writing or podcasting or creating YouTube videos and channels. People have different skills, right? So equality of outcome just seems very problematic when it comes to making sure everybody hits the same level if it's a high level. There's a question about whether the equality of outcome, so in education, for example, and this happens in higher education and in secondary and elementary education, there's a minimal standard that people are supposed to hit. So there's kind of a threshold, and that's a different kind of assessment. So the equality argument is usually that we want everybody to have equal outcomes when it comes to a minimal standard. And setting that minimal standard and the context in which that minimal standard is set is highly contested. Um, and so when we define equality of outcome, we may be thinking that there's a minimal standard, and once you get above that minimal standard, then you can do competition, which seems fair, right? So some of us, like I said, might be better at some tasks than others. But if all of us know how to do our taxes, for example, know how to do the mathematics that lead to taxes and know how to read the tax code and know how to do our finances, that's better for all of us because we're going to have less problems with doing our finances. And when fewer people have financial problems, the whole society is going to do better because nobody's going to be relying on somebody else to take care of them, for example. So, equality of outcome when it comes to a minimal standard is one thing. Equality of outcome when it comes to everybody doing the exact same thing in a specific task seems problematic, for example. So we should define that because the context and how we define equality in these different avenues of assessment is very, very important. And assessment and evaluation has come up with very many different metrics and ways of thinking about what it means to have equality, equity, and even social justice. Some of them are numerical and some of them are more qualitative. So, for example, everybody should be able to feel safe in their school equally, at least to a minimum standard. Some of us will have more comfort in schools than others, or some of us might like school more than others, but we should all feel safe equally. And then equity comes in when we're starting to talk about how safe should we feel and how included should we feel, or how popular should we feel. Those are all different contexts. So, secondary school students are very concerned about their popularity because their social brains are developing. And so that's a big part of movements in terms of inclusion and diversity and equity. Thinking about inclusion, diversity, and equity together is a very complicated conglomeration of ideas because we are talking about having students who are looking at exploring their identities and are trying on different identities, having pressures from outside to do a certain kind of fitting in sometimes when it's applied inappropriately. The principles of it, like equity, diversity, and inclusion, is all students should be able to feel included and safe and happy in school. I completely agree with that. All students should, the diversity of students is a strength, and everybody's experiences and lived experiences contribute to our society. That's a principle that I completely agree with. Everybody should have the supports they need to be able to feel good in their school. Also, that's equity. I also completely agree with that. So that principle seems unproblematic. But then when we get to the contextual questions, how people apply that can be very, very drastically different. And in fact, can sometimes lead to opposite effects than what these principles stand for. And that's the big problem. When we don't think contextually, we start to think about making sure that all students are talking the same way or all students are thinking the same way about certain topics. That's not equity, diversity, or inclusion. And in fact, can be very isolating and exclusionary for a lot of students. And it doesn't necessarily, each context will be different in terms of whose identities are going to be marginalized and whose identities are going to be included in that. People who have a certain linguistic capacity for using the proper terms or words, young students who are teenagers, for example, who can use these linguistic you know norms that we've created, usually get ahead and then they exclude people. And so it's not inclusion because they set a standard that is now no longer accessible to everybody. These are some of the debates that we're having. And it's a really fraught debate because the goal is to make sure that all students are feeling included, that our the diversity that is a strength of our society is being honored, and that everybody has the supports they need to do that. So this is where the tension lies. And partially, social justice is a way to start thinking about how to circumvent some of these tricky questions about the contextualization of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Because, yeah, go ahead.
Before we go into justice, that's a really good one. It also, as you just laid out and you really basically indirectly pointed to it, it becomes also political anyways, because there's always an allocation of resources no matter what we decide, right? And so it becomes a trick in this sense. But what I think it's also very important to always remember, and I think most people agree on what you just said, is the fact that we have to make sure that everyone reaches a certain level, okay, that we have a basis level, so we can really, practically speaking, really live with one another, right? We actually do. It's the same thing with history or whatever context, whatever content you are teaching is so politicized, right? On one hand, because they think like, well, that's on one hand it's propaganda, the other says like, well, now that's the correct history. So it's really hard, but I think the most takeaway is really that we at least have some common, as you said, uh, an equality of knowledge that we pass on, so that we have actually at least the very very least the common denominator and the common like knowledge that we can actually discuss. How we interpret
Mhm.
it ultimately, that's a whole other. That's what you are saying too, right? It's about context ultimately. That's really important. But at least we don't shout at each other, but we can actually, know, okay, we have something in common. At least we we know some common terms that we somehow can discuss and have potentially a fruitful discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really what makes a society function, especially a democratic society. Because one of the great strengths and one of the great challenges of a democratic society is that everybody matters in theory. And we want everybody to matter in reality. And historically, that has not been the case. And historically, there have been groups that have been marginalized for various reasons, and we can go into them. But I think that I want to stick to the kind of principle thinking versus the contextual thinking, and we'll get into that when we talk about social justice. Right now, the tricky challenge, and like you said, the most important thing is to have this baseline of, okay, here are our knowledges. Here's the baseline knowledge about how democracy works in Canada, in the United States, in Europe, in Latin America, in Asia, in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, in Northern Europe. I mean, all over the world, there's different forms of governance. But when you know how your government works and the governance systems work, then you can start to understand how to make good decisions for yourself, your community, and for the whole country. When we have a baseline, and I think that the education right now is really focused on how students are doing in terms of their well-being, as well as their academic accomplishments. When we are talking about this baseline, for example, everybody should be able to feel, in my mind, this is a principle I have, when you go to school, you should be able to not be worried about bullying, about somebody physically attacking you. Those are baseline, right? Now, if you have a group of friends that you're close with, and there's a group of friends that you don't really want to talk to, that's a different question. But at the same time, we want to be able to have that group of friends that you're close to and the group of friends you don't want to talk to be able to interact together at least in a way that is not leading to uh, conflict, violent conflict, um, belittling, bullying, things that can cause harm. And so there's a nuance to thinking through what it means to have a safe space, because it's also important for people to be able to explore their ideas and their identities and express themselves. And at the same time, that self-expression and that exploration should not be harming other people. And so now you have this conflict, this tension. And that's where a lot of the contextual thinking gets really murky, because you have people who have inherited traumas, who have been historically, whose parents or who themselves have experienced marginalization, oppression, and violence. And that pain and that trauma is very real, and that it needs to be understood and explored and honored in their spaces, especially in schools where they're exploring what it means to be a human being and a citizen and a person in community. How do you navigate that requires different kinds of thinking and different kinds of principles than just having this kind of broad principle: we're going to have equity, diversity, and inclusion. Because, like I said, if you apply it contextually in the wrong way, you can actually do exactly the opposite of what you say you want to do, because contextual thinking is different than principled thinking. So, um, when we are thinking about this, one of the other ideas that we have been starting to build towards is this idea of social justice, or justice in general. And the definitions of justice are also equally fraught when it comes to how this word is used, the denotation of the word, and the connotation of the word. So, the connotation of the word justice has changed over time. Um, you know, justice as a concept is kind of a murky concept. It's a feeling, but it's also a legal standing. Um, but the idea is that in general, the connotation nowadays is that there is some kind of wrong that has been righted, which is kind of a historic one, or there's some kind of existence that leads to some kind of fairness. So justice and fairness are very intricately intertwined. And it usually means that there's some kind of reality where retribution has occurred, and um, rights have been wronged. Social justice has a slightly different connotation, because now it's about something broader. It's now not just, and justice is ill defined. And there's a lot of scholars who talk about justice these days, and using justice as a framework to think about the historical wrongs that have happened, but also the current realities that we're living in. The connotation of justice today and social justice is thinking through systems that are oppressive. It's thinking through words and ways of thinking and ways of being that have been steeped in supremacy of one kind or another. Sometimes it's white supremacy, sometimes it's ethnic supremacy. But there are lots of different supremacies that justice is couched in when it's talking about what should not happen. So, supremacy is considered antithetical to justice, and I would agree with that principle. Supremacy is antithetical to justice. That's principle in a principled way, and in context, that is very applicable. So when there is some group that is exploiting other groups to continue to get more goods, feel better about themselves, to kind of live in a way that is inaccessible to other people, that's supremacy. Justice is making sure that that supremacy no longer exists. That's a connotation now. And I think that that's also really important when we're starting to think about equity, equality, and justice, because justice is about thinking not only about this baseline, but also about how do we live together in a society. Now, some of us can be better than others at certain things. Does that mean some of us should be able to put other people down or live in a way that other people could not even dream of living in? That's a big question for our society. Historically, it was the case that, if you were better at certain things, you would earn more money and you could live that way. But that was couched in a lot of kind of cultural and racial and ethnic ideas. And so the opportunities and the way in which justice did not exist was because even though there's this idea of meritocracy was about kind of what's called the hidden curriculum or a hidden set of cultural rules that allowed you to get access to these goods. And that is inherently unjust. If you are a talented and hardworking individual, or even if you're just a hardworking individual who can do the tasks that need to be done, why should you be excluded just because of some of the identities that you embody or some of your lived experience? Now it gets trickier, and I hopefully that this doesn't get too convoluted and complicated, but it gets trickier when we're talking about historical oppressions too. So, we're talking about social justice. We're talking about the removal of current realities where there is injustice. And that allows us to think about not only this idea of supremacy, but it also, when we're talking about things like education, it allows us to think about things like having people get access to what they're good at and what they like. When we're talking about social justice, we're talking about, let's say there's somebody who's really talented at art, but the school system, because of a over focus on math and science, pushes that student out of art and brings them into math and science. And that student is now miserable because that is not what they're good at and it's not what they care about. And yeah, do they need to hit a certain benchmark to be able to do the math and science that is necessarily for um, for living in society? Absolutely. But after that, why is the school system keeping this student stuck in a space that they don't belong in? Why are they creating this sense of supremacy that is not opening up the curriculum for students, regardless of their identity, to explore and live the kinds of lives that they want to live within the bounds of what it means to live in society? So, there might be it, there are a variety of activities that may be outside of the bounds of society, but most things that people want to do to live, such as the arts, music, athletics, literature, science, math, um, you know, physical, like dance, all of these different kinds of activities, music, um, history, social studies, all of this stuff leads to different kinds of jobs, law, philosophy. And when we think about justice, oftentimes we only think about the kind of historical wrongs that need to be righted. But another part of justice that I think is really important is the opening up of the ability for all people, regardless of their identities, to have opportunities to explore that, and for society to find the people who are interested and good at what it is they need to do in order to do those jobs in society and to live in society well. Um,
I love that. Just quickly, because this to me is to some extent strength-based education, right? Where you touch on this about values and ultimately purpose, which leads to vision and obviously a mission. But I just want to quickly go back to this what you just said, because there are so many important points. And one thing I think we all agree is that we have to acknowledge, and we acknowledge at least most people, that there is a problem, historical wrongs that are still tangible, right? I saw this also like when I was living in Montreal, and I could just tell that the tension between different people from different language, and cultures. You could feel it. So history is really alive. It's now. It's not just the past, right? And with intergenerational trauma, we all have now the evidence, obviously, of that. Now the question is just always, I think, it's how we go about it, right? And that's always, it becomes very politicized and really hard even just to to agree on a term such as justice, equity, and equality, right? So it's
Right.
that is the big challenge that I think is so difficult, like generally speaking. And as you said, right? I mean, we reached a point where we had to really limit everything. Let's say, we go back and play is so important, right? Today children, we know, don't play enough anymore, right? It's just, they
Mhm.
are somehow in front of the screens. We completely mess up, their biochemistry. Therefore it leads all sorts of severe consequences that emerge, that ultimately school have to deal with, which also leads to some extent to a general confusion of who you are, right? I mean, not saying that that is a problem, but I think it just it has escalated, the past like 15 years. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I
absolutely. I
just
mean,
gonna
that's
quickly, I just want to quickly, because one thing is so important, that we have this. The fact is that intergenerational trauma is a huge thing, and it's tangible. Most children today, I mean, Christina Mason, she does an outstanding job, and her colleagues, in heart-centered learning, and really how important it is, and how to actually alleviate these problems and address it, because it really comes back also to an educator, right? To have this empathy, to have this compassion and love, and to empower marginalized kids, for example, black kids who get marginalized because of, for example, on just a bias that exists in everyone, right? But the big problem, I think, is too that, and that's what Viktor Frankl also argues in his Man's Search of Meaning, is too that it doesn't come as a collective guilt, right? That's also very important, because that's also injustice, like, but just caused in a different way, right? And I think causing injustice, we never can build a just society by causing another injustice, right?
right, exactly, and that's really the crux of what I'm talking about with contextual thinking. Why it's so important, because, like you said, um, it's unjust to blame somebody for something they did not do, and yet many times, and it's also unjust to paint a whole group of people with a single brushstroke. When we're talking about contextual thinking, we need to understand how to apply ideas like equality, equity, and social justice to make sure that we're applying it properly. So it's equally unjust that the history and intergenerational trauma exists today. It's unjust. You're talking about children of color in particular, just the intergenerational trauma and the existence. It's real. It's tangible. It exists. We live in an unjust society. That is real. Now, how do we go about addressing that problem, addressing this injustice? Like you said, you cannot create another injustice to solve an injustice. I mean, it's as simple as two wrongs don't make a right, but it's a lot more complicated than that as well. That's an old saying that kids get hurt a lot, but there's a depth to that saying that is really important. When we're thinking about justice, a just response to an injustice is as important as identifying what the injustice is. So a just response to the injustice is, for example, in education, which is easier than addressing the economic, socio-political, politicizing challenges in our society. But in education, which is kind of what I study, is how to create a socially just education, honoring and appreciating students' lived experiences, their identities, who they are, who they want to be, who they claim they are, that love, care, and compassion, and also the asset based, like you said, the asset based approach. All kids come with strengths. All kids need to be honored and respected. Understanding how to go about doing that as a teacher is very difficult because you may not understand all of the each student that comes into your classroom at the beginning. But as a teacher, a socially just teacher will learn who the student is, learn who their parents are, learn kind of where their strengths are, learn where they want to get better, learn where their challenges are, and appreciate them for who they are. And that's part of a socially just education. Our society would be great if it could function like that as well. Um, that's a little bit more complicated because the power dynamic of a teacher and a student is very different than the power dynamic of two citizens who are in the stage of moral responsibility. So when we talk about a socially just education, culturally based, culturally grounded education, asset based, land based, contextualized, um, student agency, making sure that students are learning how to become agents in their own lives. All of that is around social justice in education, and it means confronting the traumas, the intergenerational traumas, the history that lives within the systems today. It means confronting that, but doing so in a just way and thinking through, okay, kids are humans that are going to be exploring different options. They're going to act out sometimes. They may try to be confrontational one day. They may try to be passive aggressive one day. They may skulk one day. They may be super engaged and happy another day. These are things that happen for kids growing up. Understanding the cultural context of how that is embodied is really important as a teacher. Super, super important, because if you don't understand the cultural context of how kids are going to try on different identities and different ways of acting and being in the world, then you may interpret them wrong. And so part of the importance of thinking through socially just education is that teachers have one of the most important jobs when it comes to building a society. And that means thinking through teachers' cultural competence, teachers' intercultural competence, teachers' self reflection and self awareness to understand how they can really honor the students who are there while also providing the structures and limits that students need to know when they have uh, kind of broken a social or a relational norm. So, bullying a student is breaking a social or relational norm. They need to have the structures to be able to say, this is why you've broken a social or relational norm. And here are the natural consequences or ways to do restitution. When we think about social justice, we also need to think about the ways in which we engage in the world and how students can make restitution if they have done wrong for whatever reason. They could have been thoughtless, they could have not been paying attention. How do you make that right in a just way? Justice can run through a lot of decision makings in context because it's more contextually relevant in some ways than concepts of equality or equity. So when we're thinking about equality, equity, and social justice or justice, all three need to exist in different parts of the education system and in different parts of the society to make it a overarchingly a good society. Because each of these ideas, while very important and part of what it means to live in a society, is not necessarily the ultimate goal of what a society does or is. The ultimate goal of what a society does or is to allow people to live a life of meaning, value, health, and well-being and goodness. How do we define that? That's going to be up for a lot of debate, right? And the way that gets contextualized is super challenging. But the overarching goal of a society is to create structures and supports and freedoms and opportunities to allow people to live a life of meaning, value, well-being, and hopefully some kind of happiness and enjoyment. So justice is a means towards that. Justice work. So is equity work. So is equality work. It's a means towards a good society or a beloved community, as a lot of different social justice bell hooks being one of them, Martin Luther King talking about. It's not vengeance. And there's a difference between vengeance and justice. And there's a lot of philosophers who talk about the difference between that. But there's vengeance, which is the punishment of former wrongs. And then there's social justice, which is the retribution or restoration of past wrongs for a good life. And when we're talking about education, this is where that can be uh, fostered. This is where it can be uh, shown for students to understand what that looks like, what that feels like emotionally, how to live it, how to make things right. Because one of the challenges when we're talking about education is you can't be told what a socially just community or a good community is. You have to experience it. You have to be living in it to understand how to maintain it, to understand the context, the contextual thinking, the contextual way of being in a just way and in a good way in society. And so when there are teachers who can model this, because one of the major misnomers in education research is that giving a set of bullet points or a list of things to memorize and then being able to regurgitate them, that's going to somehow change the way a person lives in the world. That is not the case. You're actually teaching them something different, which is you need to memorize something, sit in your chair, act in a certain way, and do this task. You're teaching that more than you are whatever that material is that they need to memorize. Our mirror neurons are much more learning adept than our memorization capacity. And in fact, we remember physically way longer. Our bodies remember everything. Our brains don't remember more than a certain percentage, which is pretty small, but there's a lot of debate about what that percentage is of what we've seen, heard, tried to memorize over the years. Creating just schools teaches students to live in a just way. And so when we start to think about social justice education as a way of living in a society where all students are honored, where wrongs are restored, where identities are recognized, where history is learned, where basic skills equal, we all achieve an equal basic skill level, and we find the things that we are good at and that contribute to society. And that's how people, that's what students see in terms of representation. There's people that look like them who are doing the things that they want to do, and there's teachers there who are representing another aspect of it. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about a just school. And I think that most parents would want that for their kids, having their own identities as parents, their histories, their cultures being honored, and having other people's histories and cultures being honored, and learning how to work on the skills necessary to be a good citizen, and then work on the skills necessary to live a good life and contribute to society. Now, that's more contextual thinking, and it's easier said than done, right? Much easier said than done, because that means that teachers have a major responsibility, that school leaders have a major responsibility, that parents have a major responsibility to model this behavior for the children. And so we need teachers and school leaders and parents to start to think about how do they at least start to model that so that their kids can be 20% better than they are. Because it's not going to happen overnight. But if we have the iterative cycle of improvement in our generations, and each generation can be 20% better than the past generation, maybe we'll get somewhere that's sustainable and allows us to continue to live on this earth as a human society. Because right now it's not working out so well.
And what you really also talk about is really about empowerment. I think that's so important. And a lot of times when I talk to colleagues, is that this switch hasn't really been done. Still, a lot of think that they are just here basically as knowledge keeper and pass it on, like the banking system, right? As I learned from you, like Freire, right, talk about it, and so and then there is another problem there too, which in addressing this whole like trauma which is real, is that we do not fall into this Pygmalion effect, right, where we actually just reinforce this whole trauma because we somehow treat certain students as somehow victims, but they're clearly actually not. And I always say to my students, marginalized groups, I tell them all the time, you know what, you have all the right to blame the past, to blame this group or that group, because it's true. I see it daily. And I also want to tell you, you have to just ask yourself, does it help you or not? Is it empowering for you or is it disempowering? Does it make you feel like take action, feel better or not? That's the big question. And if we can somehow, as you said, like modeling, you have to ultimately be to some extent the change that you really want to see in the world, right? And I think that's the big challenge. But I think I'm very hopeful. There's so outstanding people who work in this space that yeah, I think that's also something which is important, is that we actually model also hope, that there is
Mm.
something that we can live for tomorrow. Whether you're an atheist or not, it doesn't really matter, but just that you have this faith, hey, tomorrow the sun will rise again. And so, yeah. And furthermore, I want to point this out too. You mentioned this a lot of times, and I think it's so critical: honoring perspective. And Peter Swing is such an inspiring educator and entrepreneur, edupreneur. And he really says this all the time because he went through this, right? I mean, he all the time he identifies himself clearly as not American, but Filipino American, for example, right? Because that's also what he lived all the time, right? That he, because of the way he looks, somehow is not recognized, as fully American, which is ridiculous, right? So I really, really appreciate what you said, Joe. That yeah, and I think there's so much.
Yeah, thanks, Unique. So two points that I just want to highlight based on what you said, because I thought that was really helpful. What you were saying in terms of clarification. One that's really important is, as part of that education, that's honoring perspectives. Um, One is the critical thinking that needs to be part of that. So making sure students aren't, the modeling is really important because it allows us to test, the John Dewey, William James, American pragmatists, W.B. Du Bois, um, allows us to experience and test and reflect, experience, test, and reflect how to live. So is it working? Is it not working? And the critical thinking that goes into that. So being able to learn from experience, reflect on experience, and critically reflect on experience to understand what the underlying structures are, what the overarching structures are, to then be able to change those structures, which talks about when you're talking about Freire and critical theory and all of those kinds of critical engagements with um, society so that we can understand how to make it better. So that's really important in terms of its modeling is not, and like you said, there's another issue with the Pygmalion effect, which is kind of the disempowerment or the losing of agency. I like to use the word agency just because when we're talking about denotations and connotations of word, I think empowerment has a great denotation. Connotation wise, in the past 5 years, it's really shifted some of its connotation to be kind of seen as a way of imposing empowerment on other people. So developing agency, I just use that word, but I don't think there's anything wrong with the word empowerment. I've just seen it shift in the literature, um, and honoring perspectives, and with honoring perspectives, having both cultural, intellectual, and personal humility. So like if you model humility, say I can be wrong. My perspective, I'm sharing a perspective right now. Hopefully, my perspective is thought about critically and like, okay, I can see where Joe's saying this and this makes sense to me. I can see where Joe's saying that, and maybe that doesn't make sense to me, but maybe I will, um, see what he means. But also, if somebody gives me feedback says this doesn't make sense to me, I can have cultural humility and say, okay, I've studied this for a long time. I've been working in education for over 14 years. I've been thinking and studying about this. So some of these, a lot of these ideas have been kind of tested and explored empirically, and have some articles that talk about that and show how
You
this
also
can be
have a you
supportive
also
of.
have a very important. I want to mention this. You also have a non-profit organization in Peru, which you really apply
Yes.
your knowledge. You basically facilitate the access for young girls to get
uh,
a
Boys and girls.
high school education, right? So
Yeah,
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 so
absolutely.
yeah, just go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, sorry, no. So we apply and we're working with both boys and girls because we found that the modeling is so important that we have now schools in different communities. So we've shifted to be more responsive to the community and more honoring all of the different identities within the community, because the community itself has asked, because we engage in a process of community-based participatory action research where we work closely with the community to honor their perspectives, to then engage in what's called educated listening. So we honor all their perspectives, but not all perspectives are going to be exactly right at the first go. Like every time you share a perspective, the next iteration could get better. And so we engage in a process called educated listening where we try to find each within each other. So I could misspeak and somebody's going to use educated listening to say, okay, I hear what you're saying, but what you said here doesn't make sense to me, or what you said here is, the data doesn't back this up, or what you said here doesn't ring true to me. So what are you trying to say here? And how might we change what you're saying now to get at what you really mean? Because within ourselves, we have experience and realness. And when we translate that into words, words have limitations. And so sometimes we're trying to express the realness of our experience and our lived reality and our truth. And it doesn't get processed in the way that allows other people to understand what we're trying to mean. And when you engage in educated listening, it really allows us to co-explore, because me saying this into the ether doesn't really matter. What matters is if other people hear it and think about it and understand what my lived experience and the knowledge that I bring from all of these years of working and trying to make this happen, make that real. And if it doesn't ring true to somebody, or if it's not clear and they use educated listening, maybe we can build intersubjective understanding. So then all of a sudden it becomes clear and it's okay. I can see that. And from this perspective, I can see how that's real. Now, let's think about it in other spaces, in other contexts. Is that going to work in other contexts or not? Maybe it won't, but that doesn't change the fact that you were right in your context. But now we need to think about it in broader context. It may work really well for one student and work really poorly for another student. So now we have to think about how to shift and apply different kinds of thinking. That kind of work, I think, is really, really important. It doesn't happen enough. Um, and I think what you pointed to is really, really valuable for that.
And it's really what you really, I really appreciate what you're saying, because it's really about tacit knowledge, right? You help to make sense of the tacit knowledge that potentially a student has. And I really, really happy to hear that you also work with boys now, because what we see actually, and that's also somehow like a paradox that we face, is that we think like there's a problem, but the fact is that usually the boys are just losing, well, simply because they're already 2 years younger, biologically speaking, right? And they're not so agreeable. They're just, if boys don't want to do something, they just, screw it, right? But the girls usually, they kind of, they don't like it, but they still do it, right? Just so many ways, obviously, like maturity, right? It's the biology. So so what made you change? You said like you have some wonderful communities that said, you know what, we want to actually apply this also in other communities. What made this shift? What else was it that you also said, you know what, we also will do it for boys?
Yeah. So the paradigm, and when I first started as a young 20 something, I was studying philosophy, but I really liked philosophy. But I didn't fit, and I'd always been I've always been involved in education because I think my father was an educator, my mother was an educator, so I've always been kind of good at working with people of various ages. And then so I was studying philosophy, and then a friend of mine from college had a goddaughter in the Peruvian Andes who really wanted to go to secondary school, and she didn't have access to secondary school because she lived too far away. And because he knew kind of my kind of philosophical orientation, and that I done a bunch of different work, and I was a pretty thoughtful guy, I guess. I'm just going to say that that's how he perceived me, with all due humility. Um,
True, fully
he
agree.
said, "Can you?" Thanks. Can you help me support my goddaughter in going to school and support other girls like her, because boys seem to have easier access to going to school when they live too far away than girls do. And this was in 2010, 2009, 2010. And so the idea was, we're not going to impose anything. We're going to listen to the people who live there experience and try to figure out how to solve this issue that they have identified together. So we talked to the community members, we talked to students, the girls who wanted to go. One thing that was a big challenge, especially for the parents, was safety. So what we did was we hired Quechua speaking, because this was a Quechua speaking community, Quechua speaking women to be the house director, the house mothers, and the tutors to make sure that the girls were safe, because safety is super important. And that was a big challenge. So, they would, what we decided to do was build spaces for the girls to be able to access secondary school in the public schools, because that's what they had the right to, but they couldn't get access. And what we learned along the way was that the students stuff, there was a lot of bigotry in the more urban schools. And I'm not talking about urban like Montreal, I'm talking about a town of 2,000 people, which is much larger than the town of 200 people. But there's still bigotry and bias against these students. And they didn't speak very much Spanish, they spoke mostly Quechua. And so we hired more Quechua tutors and we hired math tutors. In terms of the equity focus, we wanted to make sure that the students had equitable supports to be successful, to be able to graduate from secondary school. And we did this for girls because it was my friend's goddaughter, and also because what the research showed was that girls who are highly educated have healthier families. They are make sure that they have their rights protect. They defend their rights against men. And there's so many great, like, girls' education is so important for so many great parts of building a society. And the idea was that there was a bias towards boys to send them to school at the expense of girls, because girls could help out in the home, whereas boys would be working in the fields, but they could make more money if they graduated from secondary school. That was the case in 2010. In 2020, or in 2000, actually, it was 2016, that was no longer the case, first of all. But second of all, we realized that some of those assumptions were not accurate because we engaged in educated listening. So we thought about what the parents were saying is like, yeah, it's great. Now we have our some of the girls going to school, they're protected, they're safe. And now we have these boys going to school, but they're staying with families in the town and they work for the families, but now they're dropping out. They drop out at age 14, 15 because they don't like working, they don't like going to school, so they're dropping out. So what do we do when we find another problem? The families are like, hey, this is another problem. You kind of, you're starting to do something, and this is a small community, right? We're dealing with 11 small communities around one larger community, a town of 2,000 people. So they're like, okay, so this has been okay. It's working pretty well. The supplemental education is super helpful because now instead of dropping out, the girls are able to graduate because they get all the support they need. But one, we don't like the fact that they have to travel and leave home. And then, they come back, they come back. It's not a residential school. It's not anything like that. I want to make that perfectly clear. It's culturally grounded. It's honoring the community and the traditions and the cultures, and they stay connected to their homes. But the reality is there's not enough money. The Peruvian government doesn't have the money or the will, or they probably have the money, but they don't have the will to build secondary schools in all of these communities, and they don't have the will to do that. We've tried. We're doing advocacy work for that. But now what we decided to do is we've learned enough about the education system, and we learned enough about the realities that we started to create education centers in the communities themselves, so that boys and girls both have the opportunity to go to school, come back, and get the supplementary equity oriented, justice oriented education they need that's culturally grounded, so that they can finish school. And so now we have education centers for both boys and girls, where we have teachers from the local community, usually parents, plus some volunteer teachers from other parts, to do culturally grounded education, where they're doing support in math and computers and language. That we do Quechua language, Spanish language, and English language. We do what are called EDACs, or experiencias de aprendizaje. So educational experiences where students are learning about their roots from their parents and from their elders, and developing the core competencies that they need to be able to be successful in the school. So they're learning about communication, and they're learning about science. They're learning about traditional sciences, as well as learning about Occidental sciences, not as having one better than the other, but as 2 points of comparison to understand how to solve problems. So that's a lot of the work that we've been up to. and thinking about exactly what we're talking about, a just education. So honoring the students' identities, honoring the students' perspectives, honoring the parents' perspectives, listening, doing educative listening to solve problems and to build out education that both supports and expands students' possibilities. So we're not denying them what they want to learn. So if students want to learn about how to do programming for a computer, we're not going to say no because that's some Western Occidental problem. It's like, okay, if you want to learn that, that's fine. Also, we're going to learn this because that's also what parents want you to know is this, and you should, and the students really do enjoy learning about their own identities and building that sense of self. And I find that is such a powerful way of building agency, so that strong, you know, oyantino, also wanting to learn how to do coding because it's something they're interested in. That's the goal of social justice, is to be able to have both of those components without the oppression of one or the bigotry of another. And so that's really what we're working on. Obviously, I spend 3 to 4 months there working with the teachers. We do a lot of community-based participatory action research, so I'm talking to the parents a lot. And really, it's about listening and doing this kind of work and making sure that the students are doing well. And so we make sure that the students have opportunities to give feedback. We do these exit cards every time. So they have a smiley face, a frowny face, and a question mark, which is what did you like, what did you not like, and how can you make what you did not like better? And we do that every class so that the teachers can always reflect and improve and consistently improve. So these are some of the things that we've put into place to try to foster a socially just education.
It's uh, it's fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing, and especially too critically, you really listening, right? I think if we really become better listeners, this world will really look better. It will be never perfect, but there's always room for improvement. I think that's what we are working towards. And you mentioned indigenous sciences too. And what I also really appreciate is in terms of indigenous people in Canada. So what's really the difference is really, on one hand you have indigenous science, which is based on relationships, right? So if it's not relational, it's not science, right? On the other hand, you have the Western science, which is, if it's measurable, it's science. If not, it's not science. So there is no better combination of bringing the two together, because the facts only make sense ultimately if we somehow connect them, right? And it's really, as Neil T said, it's really, meaning comes from connection, and that's fantastic. So I really want to talk more, Joe. Hopefully you're soon back. There's so much that I want to discuss with you. You touched on so many different areas that yeah, thank you so much for being on the show, for the work you're doing, and for the outstanding educator and professor you are. Truly appreciate it.
No, thanks, Andy. I appreciate it. It's always great to be on here. It's always great to talk to you and to have these conversations. I know I talk more than I usually do. Sometimes we have more of a back and forth, but it's really great always to see you and to talk about these different ideas. And this relationality that you said was just such a great way to wrap up this conversation. So thanks for the opportunity to talk, and I'm sure we'll be in touch soon.
Sure. Joseph Levitan. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.d-ykm.com. Meant to make you